So one thing that is kind of notable about your career is that you chose the individual contributor or IC path rather than switching to be a manager. I'm curious, when you finished your PhD, did you know that that was an option? When did you realize it was an option and it was something that was of interest to you?
Let's see. When I finished my PhD, I knew nothing about industry. I didn't know IC manager. I joined a startup, so luckily, none of that stuff matters, right? Like, level doesn't matter when you join a startup, and title doesn't matter when you join a startup. Like, everyone is just there to work as hard as they can, all trying to achieve the same goal. And in a good startup, there's a level of transparency, right? Like, and I knew how much money the company had in the bank, and I knew our burn rate. And you could map out, like, this is the point in time in which the company has no money and I have no job, right? And so startups, high risk, high reward, and there's an awful lot of pressure involved in understanding I need to really move the needle and really move us towards our goals. There's also the flexibility and the ability to make huge changes in an early startup towards those goals. So that's about all I knew. It wasn't until later that I understood there are people who are managers, and literally I knew nothing. There are people who are managers who I don't know what they do, and then there are people who do the things and I know what they do. I had the opportunity to be a manager for a very short period of time at the startup, actually, which is kind of like a manager, but I think most people who are at bigger companies who actually have the formalized manager role would laugh at my characterization of me as a manager. But I had the opportunity for a short period of time, long enough to learn two things. The first was I was not a good manager. It is not within my skill set. And second was I didn't like being a manager, and I didn't want to do that. So that was the extent of my experience through the startup, and then I just maintained the IC path for the remainder of my time working professionally.
Gotcha. And as you kind of continued on in the IC path, you reached a very senior level as an IC. Can you talk a little bit about how many very senior IC engineers there are at Amazon and at Facebook? And can you kind of talk a little bit about why there are so many more high-level managers in comparison to those senior ICs?
Sure. I've looked at this in the past. For example, just prior to leaving Amazon, this was back in 2013. I looked to see how many other folks in the company were at the same level I was at. This is the senior principal engineers. There were 14 of us in total. And I remember actually when I was promoted to principal, I think there were about 13 people who were principal engineers at that time. That was like 2000. I think that was 2005 or 2004. I forget exactly what year I was promoted to the principal level. But I was a senior principal when I left. There were 14 people. 14 people represented less than 0.2% of the engineers in the company. If you look at the equivalent rank for the management track, the job title is called director. This is a level 8 position within the company, same as the IC track. If you look at the directors in the company, at that same time, 7% of the managers in the company were directors. So these numbers aren't anomalies, right? At the same time, for principal engineers, the company had roughly 1.7% of the engineers were principals. Senior managers, which is the equivalent level for the management track, had 22% of managers were senior managers. Now, the raw numbers here, you can't compare the raw numbers because there are many more engineers by virtue of what they do than there are managers. So I think the percentages really help you understand, from a distribution perspective, where does everyone land? And does the distribution between ICs and managers, does it look the same? And it's clear, it does not look the same.
Gotcha. Do you feel like there's just more of a need for higher level managers in comparison to senior ICs? Or is it just the way that things are always done in general, that the management track is, I don't know, lauded, or somehow is it needed in comparison to kind of just having a bunch of senior ICs?
Yeah. So I'd like to be clear on one thing, right? And that is, like some people say, like it's easier to get promoted as a manager than it is as an IC. And I would argue with some facets of this statement. The first is a really phenomenal engineer might find it very easy to get promoted along the IC path, maybe to principal or maybe to senior principal, maybe beyond, right? To distinguished engineer. They might find it easy, right? It might take a bunch of time, but it's well within their capability. That same person in the management track, they might not get anywhere near as far in their career in terms of the level that they achieve in the management track. It is a very different skill set. The two are very different roles. They do very different things. So it's not, an engineer starting out in their career might say, I think I'm going to go in the management track because I will progress faster and I will go higher in my career. That is not always the case. So having said that, I think that that one thing is true. One thing is certain for me. And I don't think that this is a controversial statement, although I haven't heard many people, express the statement, but I think it's true. And that is that every single organization, every company has a core need to promote managers as the company grows. There's really no way that they can get around this. If they want their managers to scale, they have to layer. And in introducing and in creating the layers, they have to either hire other people into the organization in order to oversee more managers as additional managers are added, as more engineers are added, or they have to promote the existing managers. And the best companies will really look to do both, but primarily to take and grow, invest in the people within the company in order to help them grow. So the company really has to generate and really has to dedicate resources to train and promote managers. There are, in my experience, there are 0 situations where the company has a need to promote an engineer to the next level. Like if we don't promote this, if we don't find and promote 5, SDE3s to principal engineers, then the company is going to be in a tough spot. This just doesn't exist. It does exist for the management track, and therefore it gets more attention, it gets more time, it gets more resources. So it happens faster.
What is it then you think that if there isn't that pressing need to promote the kind of senior ICs, what is it that you think that the senior ICs do to kind of progress on the IC track? Like, are there certain things that they're very good at that gets them that attention and the recognition to kind of move up?
I think this would depend on the specific company they're working in. Amazon principal engineers or senior principal engineers is very different than the engineers at, for example, Facebook, who have achieved the equivalent level. That's because they do different things and the companies value different things and want their engineers to do different things. I'll use Amazon as an example, though. I think engineers who either dive super deep into a very difficult technical domain can express purely based on their technical chops to a certain level. And then those who seek to increase their skills in helping teams, in growing people, in creating vision and galvanizing teams or organizations, and really becoming effectively a force multiplier within these organizations, they will be promoted and they will grow.
I really like that second example in particular because I think it also differentiates. I think that people clearly associate managers as leaders, but then as an IC, actually, like that's a concrete example of how you're leading without having anyone reporting into you and actually kind of growing the organization. So
there are some companies where leaders can be managers or ICs. And I think Amazon's a great example of this. I think ICs actually have a lot more flexibility when they get to the higher levels to influence and lead larger units of people. They get the flexibility in that they're not held responsible for the growth and some of the more nuanced characteristics of running an org or building an organization. But at the same time, they get to kind of steer things, especially from a technical perspective. That was my experience. other companies, and I think Facebook, unfortunately, is an example of this company, they don't view individual contributors as leaders. They want them to step up and to do certain things, but in terms of like what I think of leadership activities and what I think of, in terms of guiding organizations and helping efforts in that way, they typically don't have their ICs do that.
Do you feel like you ended up doing that kind of work anyway, or you did pivot the kind of work that you did as a senior IC at Facebook in comparison to Amazon as a result of that desire?
It's actually, I was looking forward to the change when I went from Amazon to Facebook. I really wanted to focus more on just straight coding and really creating software systems. Because I mean, at the end of the day, I think a lot of engineers get into computer science because that's a lot of fun. It's kind of unique, and I think it's really great to like have an idea in your head or listen to a product person or come up with a product idea or whatever, and like imagine how you would capture that in the logical system, in an actual coding language, and then come up with a model for it and then write it down and debug it and then launch it, see it used, and then like see people work within the restrictions of like you've tried to model some reality that you came up with in your head. You kind of approximated that, you launched it, and now people are sort of playing within those like worlds that you created. So it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy coding. And so I was looking forward to very much spending more of my time coding. And I got to spend a lot of time coding in my first, I think the first 3 or 4 years, probably 4 years. Maybe 4.5 years. Anyway, I spent a lot more time coding and really enjoyed that.
Gotcha. That's awesome that you kind of got to come full circle at the end there.